All right, welcome to our quick review of population densities. And it is just going to be a very quick review, and we're going to talk about different types of population densities and how we use population densities and some of the upsides and the downsides of using population densities. So the first thing you need to know when we're talking about population densities is that the definition of population density is the number of people in a given area or a given type of area. And if this idea of density sounds familiar, it should, because you learned about it in science class. And so really what we're doing is we're taking that scientific definition of the number of items, the number of objects in a given area, and we're applying it to population, we're applying it to people, and we're giving it that spatial perspective, and that's what makes it a geographic concept. Okay, so when we talk about population densities, there's three major types that we talk about. And the first and the most basic is what's called arithmetic density. And arithmetic density is the number of people divided by the amount of space. And it's really a very crude way of measuring how much space an individual person gets. And it can be very misleading because it's important to note that density is not the same thing as distribution. And so you can have areas that appear on the face of it to be not very dense at all, but then when you look at the distribution, everybody's living in a small area and nobody's living in other areas, or they could appear to be highly dense, and then you look at your distribution and you realize that they are actually spread out in a handful of clusters and there's basically nobody in between. So it's a very crude instrument, and there's information that it tells us and it helps us figure stuff out, but you got to be careful how you're using this particular idea. Okay, so agricultural density is the number of farmers divided by the amount of arable land. And the way that I like to remember this one is to think that the whole thing is about farmers. Okay, so and farmers are engaged in agriculture. So number of farmers divided by the amount of land that could be farmed. And it gives us a sense of how self-supporting or maybe not self-supporting a given population or a given territory might be. Our last type of population density is physiological density. And physiological density is basically a combination of the other two. So we're going to take the total number of people, we're going to divide it by the amount of arable land. And arable, again, just means land that's able to be farmed. And again, this gives us an idea of approximately how self-supporting a given population or a given territory could be. Because it's important to note that not all arable land gets farmed. And these days, especially in places like the US, a lot of the prime arable land actually has concrete and pavement on it, because most of our major cities got their start as farming villages that were in prime locations. And then their populations built up from there. And as the populations built up, streets got first cobblestoned and then ultimately pavemented or concreted over. And so a lot of that really good agricultural land is actually now underneath a lot of our cities. So some of the positive things about using densities is, again, it can give us an idea of how likely a country is to be self-supporting. It can give us some ideas about whether or not we want to build single-family homes versus apartment homes or townhomes, so we can target certain densities. When we're talking about cities and things like that, and we are going to come back to that idea, we're going to talk about some of the applications of densities as we go. And then some of the negatives is, again, it's a very crude instrument, which means it's very general. It is not the same thing as distribution, and it's easy to confuse the two. So population density can give us a very false idea of distribution. And to give you a great example of this, we take the country of Egypt, which is, on the face of it, a fairly low density country as these things go, and then you look at it and you realize, oh wait, something like 90% of the people live within approximately 15 miles of the Nile River or something like that. So when you look at that distribution, it gives you a very different idea in terms of how Egypt is being used versus looking at just the overall density, right? And if you stop and think about it, it makes sense because once you get away from the Nile River basin, you hit desert, and desert's too hot and too dry for people to live in comfortably. Okay, so we're going to keep coming back to this idea of density. We're going to talk about it when we talk about agriculture. We're going to talk about it when we talk about cities. Um, we're going to talk about it when we talk about minority populations, when we're talking about cultures. This is one of those ideas that we're going to keep coming back to, and you're going to keep seeing it. And in particular, what you're going to be looking at and seeing are the applications of it. So this has been our quick review of density. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, comments, anything like that, by all means, feel free to swing through, see me during class, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions or concerns you have.